a stranger to the dark. Hide away, they say, 'cause we don't want your broken parts. I've learned to be ashamed of all my scars. Run away, they say, no one will love you as you are. But I won't let them break me down to dust. I know that there's a place for us, for we are glorious. When the sharpest words wanna cut me down, I'm gonna send the blood, gonna drown them out. I am brave, I am bruised, I am who I'm meant to be. This is me. Look out, 'cause here I come, and I'm marching on to the beat I drum. I'm not scared to be seen, I make no apologies. This is me.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Missing Colours of the Rainbow, brought to you by the National Black Police Association in collaboration with colleagues at UK LGBT Network as well. It is a great honour to be bringing you this event as part of the National Black Police Association. As you'll know, it is really important when we're talking about race equality and equity that we think about and understand the experiences of all our brothers and sisters, and actually understand that, you know, we are all different. We all bring our unique perspectives and our life experiences. And so when we're talking about race equality, it's about talking about race equality for people of all backgrounds. And so what better excuse than to actually look at that intersectionality as part of LGBT History Month and understand the experience of those people who are from the LGBTQ plus community and how that impacts them on with race equality. So it is an hour and a half long session. We're due to finish at 3 o'clock today, and there's going to be some absolutely incredible conversations and some fantastic guests that are going to be talking about their life experiences and the importance of understanding this intersection. Just a few housekeepings from me. If we could please ask you to have your mics on mute. I know during that initial video, whilst I was quite quietly dancing inside, there was quite a lot of noise in the background as well. So if we could keep those on mute, that'd be really appreciated. Cameras, you're more than welcome to have your cameras on, off. Sometimes it is lovely to see all of your beautiful faces, but absolutely understand if you don't want to turn those on. That's completely up to you. This is a recorded session, so hopefully this will be available to colleagues following this event as well. So just bear that in mind. If you have any questions, we love questions. Questions are really important. If you could please type those questions in the chat box, really appreciate that. And at the end, there will be some opportunity for you to ask some questions to our panelists as well. So very quickly, I am the events lead for the National Black Police Association. We're bringing you these events and hopefully we'll continue to do so. And your host today is Kimberley Obongonyinge, who I'm so proud to be bringing into this conversation and hosting this event. Kimmy is a diversity, equity and inclusion consultant and a therapist specialising in racial trauma. She's a member of Surrey Police's Race Advisory Group and has previously collaborated with the NBPA as a speaker on the Black History Month event, focusing on misogynoir, which is the intersection between racism and misogyny. She supported with our Saluting Our Sisters webinar in October, and outside of her 9 to 5, she's a passionate social justice activist, which is exactly what our world needs. She's keen to ensure that intersectional and decolonial lenses are applied to DEI work and social justice advocacy. Try saying that after without any sleep. So I'm going to hand over to Kimmy, who's going to be hosting this fantastic event, and I really, really hope that you all enjoy and get lots of value out of today's wonderful event. Thank you very much. Over to you, Kimmy.
Thank you for that introduction, Farhan. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen now. Please do give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. You should see this, the missing colors of the rainbow. Unfortunately, the editing is a bit unusual. Some heads are cut off, but I don't know what's happening there. Technology is just over my head. But thank you for that introduction again, Farhan. I'm both excited and honoured to be able to present at the National Black Police Association's first ever LGBT history event, which is huge, given that the intersection of LGBT phobia and racism is often omitted from critical spaces. Additionally, as a queer, half Indo-Guyanese and half Ugandan woman, this topic is incredibly important to me. And putting this presentation together, I've learned so much about those who came before me, and I'm really excited to share what I've learned with you. Those who paved the way to making the UK a slightly safer and more tolerant place for us Black and brown queer folk. Before I get started, I do just want to give a trigger warning. I want to let you know that in my presentation, I do touch on some difficult realities. So if you do feel uncomfortable at any point, please do feel free to take whatever time you need away from. All right, perfect. So please do feel free to, take whatever space you need from the device that you're connecting to this call on. Self-care and community care is really, really important. But before we also get into my presentation, I just wanted to take a moment to kind of clarify this acronym that you might be familiar with, but you might not be aware of what it actually means, LGBTQIA+. It stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, queer, intersex, and asexual. And the plus, of course, is used to signify all of the gender identities and sexual orientations that are not specifically covered by the other 5 initials. I have put in the chat box as well a link to Stonewall's LGBT terms and definition guide. So if there are any terms or any language that I use that you're not familiar with, or any of our panelists use that you're not familiar with, please do open that up and have a look. Of course, you've always got Google as well. On the right here as well are some other terms that might come up that you may not be familiar with. So do just have a quick read through. But as I mentioned, you've got that link in the chat box that you can have a look at. I also want to just kind of note that as a queer person, I refer to myself as such, as many of us are reclaiming this word, but the word queer was used and is still used in many cases as a slur to dehumanize, marginalize, and other LGBT people. So if you are not part of this community, I do advise that you use the acronym LGBT+, just, to be respectful and conscious of the history associated with that word. So, before I delve into LGBT history in the UK, I just wanted to share with you all of these beautiful LGBT flags. We just kind of had a quick view of them in the video we just saw. You're probably most familiar with the flags to the bottom right and to the bottom left, as these flags are used to represent all of these different LGBT identities. It's all of these different flags kind of merged together. But these other flags that you might not be as familiar with represent the individual identities within the LGBT community. And I'm sharing this with you as it's a clear and colourful visual representation of the many identities which fall under the LGBT acronym. Just as us racial and ethnic minority individuals feel frustrated about the homogenization, I can never pronounce that word, homogenization of our lived experiences, so do LGBT plus folks as well. It's very important that we are not perceived as a monolith, and that our individual experiences, barriers, and challenges are spotlighted and acknowledged as well. So when looking at ethnic minority LGBT plus history, I like to start with the pre-colonial histories. Now, just a quick disclaimer, this map is by no means reflective of all of the pre-colonial LGBT histories across the world. And if your country or region isn't mentioned here, I encourage you to take a look into LGBT history within your context. It will be truly, truly fascinating. In some of these contexts, attempts to erase these identities continue due to colonial legacies. However, in others, attempts are being made to protect and reclaim these identities post-colonization. An example of this is in South Asia, specifically in India, where the Hijra, so we've just got a kind of reference to it here, to the Hijra here, who we in the UK might identify or refer to as gender fluid or transgender, were well respected and revered in ancient India for 2,000 years prior to British colonization. But unfortunately, colonial legacies led to their criminalization and persecution. However, in India, the Right for Transgender Persons Bill, drafted in 2014 and passed in 2016, has been a major milestone in protecting the Hijra community. So you might be thinking, well, why are we looking at pre-colonial histories of other countries? How is this relevant? And more specifically, how is this relevant to the UK? Well, it's incredibly relevant for those of us who identify as part of the LGBT plus community with heritage from these contexts and family in these contexts. In my case, as an example, as a second generation queer Ugandan and Indo-Guyanese woman, the legacies of LGBT plus phobia that were imported to Uganda and to the Indo-Guyanese context and India have an immense impact on my ability to be my authentic self when I visit my family in these places and my family members from these places who are now living in the UK. I'm constantly reading reports like this, especially in recent months. I don't know if any of you are keeping up with Ugandan news, but in recent months there's been an immense rise in violent hate crimes towards LGBT people in Uganda. And there are actually threats to reintroduce the death penalty that was only kind of removed a couple of years ago anyway. So it's really saddening for me to see that Uganda had such a rich LGBT plus history prior to colonization, and that many Ugandans believe now that LGBT identities are a British import, when ironically the LGBT phobia is what was imported to Uganda through Britain's colonization. So knowledge of this history makes me feel more proud to be a queer woman. When I embrace this identity, I also feel deeply connected to my ancestors, and I hope that anyone here today who has heritage or ancestry from any of these places highlighted on the map feel the same way. Looking at this history also makes it easier to understand why LGBT plus phobia is currently so prevalent in ethnic minority communities. This is probably one of the reasons. So now, just fast forwarding on the timeline to celebrate these amazing ethnic minority LGBT trailblazers in the UK. As I mentioned, as I was doing this presentation, I was learning so much about those who came before. Previously, when I learned about LGBT history in LGBT History Month or in school or wherever it was, so many of the references related to the US, and this is great. It's great to know about, those who came before in different contexts. But it can be really easy for the powerful contributions of the individuals on this slide to go overlooked. Unfortunately, time won't allow me to go into detail about all of the individuals on this slide, so I do encourage you to take a screenshot or a picture of this slide and delve into their stories outside of this space. Also, the individuals who I've chosen to highlight isn't for any particular reason. Every individual on this slide is or were equally powerful forces for change with regards to LGBT rights. So I'm going to start by spotlighting Sunil Gupta, who's a photographer whose career spans 50 years. His work has brought forth the progress of gay liberation and injustices faced by gay men all around the world. Most notably, in 1988, he produced an exhibit titled Pretend Family Relationships, which showed gay couples at home. And this is particularly, this was particularly interesting, the name, because the title of the exhibit comes from Clause 28 in the Local Government Act 1988, passed by Margaret Thatcher's government, that was very LGBT phobic, to say the least. Now, I could not do LGBT History Month presentation without spotlighting Lady Phyll. Many of you will be familiar with Lady Phyll and how she was involved in co-founding, UK Black Pride. She has increased visibility and advocacy for ethnic minority LGBT+ people in the UK. And as mentioned, one of her landmark achievements is as the co-founder and director of Black Pride, which is the first event of its kind in Europe, founded in 2005, celebrating ethnic minority LGBT people, given that mainstream pride can often be unsafe for ethnic minority queer people. There is a lot of violence, a lot of racism in this space. So this provides us with a space to be able to participate in and to be able to celebrate our identities within. So many of you will be familiar with intersectionality at this point. It's been something we've spoken about quite a lot since 2020. But for those of you who aren't aware, I'm just going to kind of give a very brief overview. So often when we talk about LGBT+ identities and ethnic or racial minority identities, we often look at them separately. We put them in separate boxes, and we don't often consider the experience of those who both identify as a racial ethnic minority or LGBT+. So intersectionality is a concept that was coined in 1989 by Kimberley Crenshaw, an African-American scholar, lawyer, and co-contributor to the critical race theory. Intersectionality refers to the overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage that individuals face. It emphasizes how race, gender, sexuality, class, and other identity markers cannot be examined in isolation and should not be examined in isolation, but must be understood in their interconnectedness, shaping unique experiences of oppression. So here you have a diagram of kind of what that intersection could look like. And this is just a few of many identities. So now let's take a look at what some ways that institutionalized LGBT+ phobia presents. So on the next three slides, the kind of information in the circle that is highlighted in white is linked to policing, either within the police force or within kind of police interactions with the public. And then everything in kind of the darker blue relate to other institutions like healthcare and education. And of course, there is a lot more information. Well, not a lot more, but there is more kind of examples of institutionalized LGBT phobia, within healthcare and education. But just, I wanted to make sure that this presentation was really relevant to UK policing. So the recent Casey review, many of you are probably very familiar with this. Many of the statistics on these following slides relating to UK policing are from this review. And this review, as many of you will know, has been fundamental in highlighting institutionalized LGBT phobia in UK's police force, among other types of institutionalized oppression and discrimination. The review highlights that 19% of LGBT Met Police respondents surveyed directly experienced homophobia. Many respondents also reported being hypersexualized and stereotyped. And one testimony that really stood out to me, really called out to me in this review, there are many testimonies that further contextualize the experience of LGBT+ folks. But one that really called out to me was that of an individual who reported that their colleagues, particularly their male colleagues, I'm talking about cisgender, heterosexual male colleagues, were overly invested in her and her partner's intimate life, which ultimately made her feel unsafe and uncomfortable at work, because that's just something that you wouldn't have to address if you were a heterosexual or cisgender person in the workplace. Additionally, the legacies of legislation that enabled the incarceration of numerous LGBT people, such as the Buggery Act in 1533, which was only revised in 1954 by the Wolfenden Report, and Section 28 passed in 1988, which prohibited the promotion of homosexuality, so I mentioned this just a little while ago, by local authorities, which was in effect in Scotland up until 2000 and England and Wales up until 2003, still evoke feelings of distrust between LGBT people and police. A recent Stonewall report found that Of the 64% of survey respondents who had experienced an LGBT hate crime, only 1 in 8 reported the most recent incident that they had experienced to police. So now we're going to take a look at institutionalized racism. You might be more familiar with this. This is definitely something that I feel is spoken about, at least in the spaces I'm within, the anti-racist spaces that I'm within. And we don't often, again, look at this intersection. But this doesn't just look at racism. This also looks at xenophobia. This looks at faith-based discrimination due to their often race-based nature. And when looking at these statistics, we do see some similar trends. So, for example, we see trends like the representation, the underrepresentation of ethnic minority persons in policing and distrust towards police. We see incredibly high hate crimes as a result of Islamophobia. And one study reported that in 2023, there was a 600% rise in Islamophobic incidents in the UK, which is shocking. We also see an overrepresentation of Black women mishandled in missing persons cases, and they're less likely to be referred to domestic abuse organisations by police when experiencing intimate partner violence. So I hope you know that the reason for sharing these stats with you isn't to make you feel discouraged, but it's just to help kind of get a better picture of what this institutionalized discrimination, the intersection of this looks like within UK policing, so that we can understand the importance of addressing this, taking a holistic approach. So here we now have both of these two circles merged to look a bit clearer at what that intersection actually looks like. So imagine if you're a South Asian lesbian woman, you will not only face this, but you will also face this very unique type of oppression that is a consequence of these two merged forms of oppression. A Stonewall report found that ethnic and racial minorities experience LGBT plus phobia at higher rates in comparison to white LGBT individuals. This is definitely a direct consequence of the intersection of racism and LGBT phobia. This layered discrimination amplifies their experience of LGBT plus phobia as they navigate both racism within broader society and within LGBT plus communities, as well as homophobia and transphobia within their own racial or ethnic communities. Racially marginalized individuals, LGBT plus individuals, may be also more visible targets for discrimination due to existing racial stereotypes and biases. This visibility can make them more susceptible to LGBT plus phobia and violence. Additionally, economic disparities, which we're very familiar with within these kind of identity groups, and social marginalization compound the challenges faced by racially marginalized LGBT plus individuals. These inequalities and inequities can lead to limited access to support services, healthcare, and community spaces that are affirming to their identities. We also need to consider as well cultural and religious beliefs within certain racial or ethnic communities that can also influence the experience of LGBT plus individuals. And finally, there's often a lack of representation of racially marginalized LGBT plus individuals in media and advocacy spaces for various reasons, which can lead to feelings of isolation and invisibility. And I think that one of our panelists are going to touch on this a little bit later. So just to summarize this kind of intersection in terms of what it looks like, it's really important to recognize that building supportive communities and networks can be more challenging for racially marginalized LGBT plus individuals due to racism within predominantly white LGBT plus spaces and homophobia or transphobia within their own racial or ethnic communities. When we don't consider the intersection between institutionalized LGBT phobia and institutionalized racism, we aren't able to create inclusive and safe spaces for individuals who hold multiple marginalized identities, nor address these systemic issues in a holistic way. So again, I really do want to highlight that it's great that the MBPA are holding space for this event. Recognizing this intersection is how we start this critical conversation. And hopefully this will be the start of many future conversations around this intersection within the MBPA and inspire other policing networks to start exploring the way these institutional forms of oppression intersect. So where might you encounter this intersection on the job? So just before I kind of speak a little bit about this, I just wanted to give you all just 1 minute to share in the chat box what your thoughts are on this. So based on what I've said, if you consider how these intersecting forms of institutional marginalization and discrimination intersect, I would love if you could just share some of your thoughts on where you might have encountered this intersection on the job, or where you think you might see this intersection on the job, before I go on to the next slide. So I'm just going to stop sharing to be able to see the chat box. Yeah, interesting within affinity groups. Thanks, Rhammel. For sure. Both within and outside policing. Yeah, victims of hate crimes. Absolutely. Yeah, within families and social groups. And I guess there's intersections within these spaces as well, because of course you might see families and social groups being the perpetrators of those hate crimes in a lot of cases within ethnic minority, LGBT. That is often the experience for ethnic minority LGBT plus folks. I'll just give you another few seconds to share some of your thoughts before I go back to my slides. Yeah, definitely. Microaggressions in the workplace that aren't just homophobic or transphobic, but also have that racial component, that racism element to it. Amazing. Please do continue to share. And also, I forgot to mention at the beginning, you know, there is so much information. Well, there isn't enough information on this topic, but I just want to allow you as well to share any kind of information that you have on this topic in the chat box too, just so you know we can invest in a bit of collective knowledge as well. So if there's anything that you think is missing from my slides, which is probably a lot of information, please do share what knowledge you have on this topic as well in the chat box. So I'm just going to go back to sharing. Oh, sorry, one moment. Okay. So yeah, some of the ways in which this intersection can show up, some of you had mentioned them. So for example, hate crimes, not just, I put intimate partner violence here, but also we see violence coming from within households as well, often in the case of LGBT plus individuals. So thank you so much for your contributions. But some of these statistics, by the way, were included on the previous slides, but some of them are completely new. So do have a quick scan through them. And just for clarity, all of those with the pride flag next to it, as in a circle next to them, relate to the LGBT plus individuals. Race and ethnic background isn't specified, but I don't want to just kind of suggest that this is only relating to the white population, because of course this will also incorporate some of the experience of ethnic minority groups as well. But all of those as well with a black circle next to them relate to ethnic minorities in the UK. So all of these statistics here highlight systemic issues within policing and social support systems that affect the LGBT ethnic minority communities disproportionately. So as an example, for homeless individuals within these communities, interactions with the police can be a crucial gateway to receiving support and accessing services. However, if police are not adequately equipped to recognize and address the unique challenges faced by LGBT plus racial minorities, these individuals might not be referred to the appropriate support services, might be sent back to unsafe environments, which can exacerbate their vulnerability and prolong their homelessness. Additionally, in the increased rates of depression and suicide attempts occurring among LGBT plus individuals, coupled with racial disparities in the application of Section 136, Section 136ing, I'm not sure if you can use that as a verb, suggests that LGBT plus ethnic minorities are more likely to interact with police during mental health crises. And we do know that often disproportionate force are also used against individuals who are from racial minority groups. So again, these statistics aren't to scare you, aren't to make you feel discouraged, aren't to say, you know, what the police aren't doing well. It's just to have a better idea of what this intersection looks like, and to understand that, you know, if you've got 24% of people at risk of homelessness in the UK identifying as LGBT plus, and then you've got 24% of people who are making homelessness applications coming from ethnic minority groups. If you put that together, that means that we are going to be seeing ethnic minority LGBT individuals overrepresented in those statistics. And it's really important as police, as people who are going to kind of be the first respondents and supporters in these cases, to be aware of where you might see this intersection on a job. So sorry, I have gone over time, so I'm just going to finish up my presentation. Please do take a quick screenshot of this slide. It's just some recommended resources so that you can continue building your consciousness and awareness of this intersection. It's the best way to build an affinity with LGBT ethnic minority individuals, just by understanding some of the context, the history, and the lived experiences. So do take a screenshot of that. And now I'm sure you're all incredibly tired of hearing from me. So I'm just going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to introduce our panel. So, oh, yeah, just making sure I've stopped sharing. So each person on the panel is going to speak for about 7 minutes, more or less, and then we'll have a brief panel discussion. So we're going to have everybody speak first, then I'm going to ask our panel a couple of discussion questions, but we also want to give you all a chance to ask the panel questions as well. So please write down any questions that come to mind, or share them in the chat box as they speak, as you're going to have a chance to ask them before we close up the event. I also just want to highlight that whilst we have some amazing speakers, there are many identities that are not present on our panel. So as always, do continue your own research and learning outside of this space to learn about other perspectives on this topic. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead now and introduce our first speaker, which is Andy George, who is the president of the National Black Police Association and a serving officer in the Police Service of Northern Ireland. He's a vocal and committed ally to the LGBT+ community across the UK, actively advocating for inclusivity and equality within and beyond UK policing. So I'm really excited to hand over now to you, Andy George.
Good afternoon, everybody. Apologies for not having the camera on. I am currently in between meetings and walking about London, but I felt it my solemn duty to come on and join everybody for this exciting event today. The reason that we're here is to share the stories of our members, and that's our members from all backgrounds. I'm constantly speaking to people within our membership, and as an organisation that pushes policing to be more inclusive and to make sure that we are representing everybody, I wanted to make sure that our members from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, who also identify from the LGBTQIA+ community, have a space to share their lived experiences as well. So I won't be speaking for 7 minutes today. I think it's really important to let them have the platform. I'm here as an advocate. I'm here as somebody in a position of responsibility, and I find it a real responsibility to make sure that we not only represent and push for our own groups, but we make sure that we stand up for all of those people, no matter who they are, and no matter what their background, who can't always stand up for themselves. So that's the purpose of today. It's to share, it's to educate, it's to showcase those that don't always get showcased. And I'm a firm believer that nobody can pull down one wall of discrimination and leave others standing. So whilst we do push and focus on race and ethnicity, we're here to represent everybody, and we're here to do what we can to make policing better. So I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody. There's a helicopter coming up now, so I am going to end up handing over, and I can't wait to hear everybody's lived experience. So thanks for joining us, and I'm looking forward to taking part in the panel discussion shortly.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's so true, as you know, the famous Harriet Tubman quote goes, you know, we're not free until we're all free. And it's so true, this community approach as well. I really like that you spotlighted that it's not any one person's responsibility, that it's for all of us to come together in unity and advocate for one another. So thank you so much for that. Really looking forward to hearing you on the panel discussion. I'm now going to hand over to Saba Ali. Saba works with many governing bodies to facilitate change and also sits on the Metropolitan Police Service LGBT plus independent advisory group, and trans and non-binary forum. So I will hand over to you now, Saba.
Thank you so much, Kimmy. Gosh, there's so many people in the room that I know that I see as peers, so I suddenly have a bit of imposter syndrome going on. I want to first and foremost, my disclosure I do whenever I speak is I'm postmenopausal, I'm a bit neurospicy, and I do tend to go all over the place. So I'm going to be reading off my notes so I don't end up talking about croissants and cats, which are two of my favourite things. So I want to talk about my work and some of my observations that I sort of noticed over the recent years. One of the main things I've noticed from my work and the various institutions and organisations is that on the whole, everything is seen through a heteronormative and Western lens. So it doesn't take into account the diversity and richness of many of the multicultural communities within London. So I'm talking about London because I live in London, I work in London, which means that quite often the cultural nuances are overlooked because they're not understood, they're not recognised. Perpetrator behaviour, for example, a parent not allowing their child to speak to someone of authority, therefore controlling a narrative, or a man using physical force, is thought acceptable and is often associated with cultural practice. I actually heard on a pop day where I often work with new recruits, facilitate, not work, I heard a new recruit say that it's okay for a man to hit his wife because it's part of their tradition. There is no tradition where a man can hit his wife. So, you know, this is something I heard just about a year ago, and these narratives have to change. We need to stop stereotyping people and think that culturally things are acceptable. They aren't, especially when it comes to violence against women and girls. If we don't look at intersectionality, we're ignoring other aggravating factors. So when we look at someone as LGBT+, we can't ignore their disability, their class, their faith, their age. We need to break those layers down. You know, a woman can be trans, she can be Muslim, and she can be disabled. I know that because a friend of mine is. So the police need to stop looking at everything through tunnel vision. I'm not saying all police do that, some do. We need to build better communication with these communities, and we need to remove this sort of supposed white lens. When you think of LGBT hate crime, for example, the example that's nearly always given is Stephen Port, the Barking murders. So it's a white presenting perpetrator, it's white presenting victims. What about voices of black and brown people or other coloured folk? What about the trans community who suffer in silence? You know, those communities, those people deserve a voice, and their stories need to be told. I said I'm going to go on a bit of a topsy-turvy journey. I also want to touch quickly on the London Race Action Plan. When I joined the working group last year, when it launched in July, one of the first things I noticed that the plan was written very much by cis het man. And I pointed out in that meeting that if you're going to look at the black community, you need to remember they come in all guises. Believe it or not, black people can be gay, they can be lesbian, they can even be trans. And it was abundantly clear to me that the queer folk, as well as like touching on violence against women and girls and disability, have been completely missed out of the plan. I was told disability will be touched on later, and I'm glad that Workstream 4 now does pick up Vogue and LGBT has been incorporated, albeit just touched on and not in detail. But it shouldn't take, you know, community to point that out in 2023-24, that these, you know, these things should be considered automatically. Our communities should be recognised and considered without us having to prompt it. Especially when our community is constantly discussed in the media, in politics, it can't be forgotten. One thing which also saddened me recently, for the past few years, the Met have worked with the community and run several internal events for their LGBT staff for LGBT History Month. Last year, for example, I helped arrange 5 lunch and learns. We had some brilliant speakers. This year, there was nothing held for the community. In October, they celebrated every day of Black History Month, and absolutely rightly they should do. But I was really disappointed that for LGBT History Month, they didn't do anything, not a single day for the community, and that really disappoints me. You know, if they're trying to attract Black and LGBT officers, you know, how about recognizing us and celebrating us, and not just a token gesture during Black History Month? So that for me is quite disappointing. I do want to end on a slightly happier note. And Kimmy, you mentioned Lady Phil earlier. I'm proud to say that I'm part of the courting for UK Black Pride. I know Sid in the audience is also a member of UK Black Pride. And I want to leave you with a quote that she said recently. Intersectionality is very much at the core of my work. Being part of the community, being South Asian, being a woman, having hidden disabilities, the list goes on. So I tick a lot of boxes. So when I look at stuff, I can look at it through many lenses. So the quote by Lady Phil is, intersectionality is the key to understanding the complex layers of identity and the unique challenges faced by marginalised communities. By acknowledging the intersections of race, gender and class, we can work towards a more inclusive and equitable society. At UK Black Pride, we strive to create a safe, brave and empowering space, celebrating our identities and fostering a sense of belonging. Together, we're breaking down barriers, challenging stereotypes and paving the way for a brighter future. So I hope today we can help to foster a sense of belonging, break down some of those barriers and challenge those stereotypes and be included in those conversations. I think I've given you 2 minutes back, Kimmy.
Thank you very much, because I definitely went way over time. Thank you so much, Saba, for reinforcing the importance of applying an intersectional lens to our advocacy in our work, and also for spotlighting the importance of making space for those who are the least represented, but the most marginalized, namely in this case, ethnic minority LGBT plus folks, to be able to have agency and a voice in important decision-making spaces within the police and beyond. So thank you so much for sharing your insight. I'm now going to hand over to Ubaid, who is the Senior Diversity and Inclusion Advisor at the College of Policing. He played a key role in organising and planning this event today, so thank you very much, Ubaid, bringing the and really pushed to bring this critical conversation of the intersection between institutionalised LGBT plus phobia and racism in UK policing to light. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Ubaid. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. And yeah, I just want to start by saying thank you very much for the MBPA for holding this event, and also especially to Kimmy for hosting it and chairing it. It's an honor to join all of you today and speak in front of you all about this area. Although I am a senior diversity inclusion advisor here at the College of Policing, and I have been here for about 2 to 3 years, I am talking from a personal perspective, and my views are not a reflection of the organisation that I work for. We've talked a lot about intersectionality, and I just want to throw it out there that I identify as a gay and deaf British Pakistani Muslim cis male, and the reason why I'm saying that is because we're talking about intersectionality, and I really want to throw that out there that so many of us in this room come with so many identities, and it's great when Kimmy was presenting on intersectionality, the overlaps that the LGBT ethnic minorities face on a daily basis. Many of that rang true for me, and then maybe also for you as well. And I've lost count of the number of times that I've experienced racism or anti-Muslim racism, disability, hate crime and homophobia and stuff. So I just want to remind everyone that, you know, as Kimmy said at the beginning about the triggering as well. So if anything triggers you, then please do take time out from what you hear. So I've been in policing for been in policing and involved in policing for over 20 years. And as a co-founder of the UK's first LGBT plus Muslim organisation, Iman, I sat on the Met Police's LGBT IAG for a couple of years, challenging the police at the time to look at closed cold cases of LGBT plus victims of a hate crime. I also led Iman forward when after 9/11 and 7/7 for the first time addressing homophobia in the Muslim community and anti-Muslim abuse in the LGBT community. I led a session on hate crime with the LGBT plus Muslim community with Tell Mama organization, as lots of these crimes were going unreported. And even when I was joined the police in the Met Police in 2005, I went on to be the policy and strategy lead for the Met Police's LGBT plus staff network, where I drove lots of changes internally as well as on service delivery, including co-writing the DEI strategy, leading the Met's response on Stonewall's work equality index, and co-leading on the establishment of LGBT advisors. And the reason why I'm saying all that is because I want to show that I'm bringing that knowledge and experience when we're talking about intersectionality. So I addressed it so many ways in my voluntary and my paid positions to kind of really push organizations and people to really think about intersectionality, and this is why I thought it was really important that we hold this event today. And thanks for Kimmy for mentioning it. But when I was approached for ideas about MBPA's first ever LGBT plus History Month event, I immediately suggested that we hold this event because we might hold an event that celebrates the lives of Black LGBT plus people and the contribution they made to society as well as policing. But if little is changing, I think it's really important that we hold this space to really bring to the surface the current issues that our people, our communities are facing. We live in a society right now where, in a political world right now where it's okay to attack Muslims with anti-Muslim language. We have a government that doesn't see this as anti-Muslim or racist and actually just calls it out for being wrong, whatever that means. We have a political world where it's okay to laugh and degrade and exclude trans people, especially trans women, while transphobia increases and trans people are losing their lives. We have a political world where policing is being told that it's being woke, to not bend the knee and not to march in pride. And all of this is affecting policing because we've got police leaders who are afraid to challenge back. And when I say police leaders, I mean senior positions, are afraid to challenge back about what being woke is and why it matters to policing, that policing should be woke to all the injustices and all the types of discriminations faced by our people and within our communities. And if it's okay for society to be anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, anti-trans, it's only expected that such instances might pop up in policing, and that's why it's really important that we start calling all that out. But we want to see it from an institutional approach rather than an individual. So I see in my position lots of strategies that are in place across policing, and our police leaders are happy to deploy an individualistic approach to rid the service of racism and sexism. Our police leaders put out anti-racism principles, and a police race action plan does little to answer how it's actually addressing institutional racism. We have a violence against women and girls strategy that, to my knowledge, has no explicit mention of institutional sexism and misogyny. And we have police leaders who want us to be courageous through the code of ethics when seeing and hearing and calling out discrimination. But we have to ask, where is their courage to own issues in policing from an institutional, organizational, systematic kind of approach rather than an individual issue? We would need our police leaders are also saying institutional racism, institutional sexism, misogyny, homophobia are unhelpful terms and want us to move beyond them. So we also work in a service where little has changed for Black people, particularly since Macpherson report, the PrAP, the Police Race Action Plan, and last year's Louise Casey report shows this. Institutional racism is alive and well in policing, in my perspective, and it's taken, Louise Casey's report. We can confidently and officially for the first time since last year, say that institutional sexism and misogyny and institutional homophobia, transphobia, biphobia within policing. It's taken decades for our people who have been saying all this for so long, our people and our communities, but now we've, those experiences have been ignored and gaslighted for so many years, but it's taken all these years to finally for it to be confirmed. Yet this arrogance by most heads of police services not to accept the terms and dismiss them as not helpful. So that's why I think it's really important that we have this space to really start addressing discrimination from an intersectional lens and how it affects our people, triggers them, how it affects our lives over many years, and how they come to normalize these, how we come to normalize these encounters, especially within the work environment. And we talk a lot about trust and community, trust and confidence, but we need to accept that we won't get very far if we don't start talking about the intersectional discrimination and intersectional denial that keeps happening in policing. And also, we internally we need to start getting to a space where staff networks, where we have these conversations, as NBPA has done today, bravely has done today, to bring this space together where we can look at institutional discrimination from an intersectional lens. Our people for too long, you go to a BPA network, Black Police Association network, to stand in solidarity about against racism. And the moment you talk about LGBT issues and stuff, they say go and speak to the LGBT network, and then you go to the LGBT network to stand in solidarity against homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and you want to talk about race or faith-based hate, and they say go and speak to NBP, the BPA or Association of Muslim Police. But there's lots of examples that I can just go on about, but I just want to end there and just say thanks to NBPA for being brave and taking a step forward to own this space and begin to address intersectionality for their first LGBT plus History Month event. They held a great conference in 2022 that exposed institutional racism for what it was, what it is, and also at that time their Vice President Dion Johnson, who has moved on from policing, but at that time she called for exactly what this kind of session is holding today, addressing institutional discrimination from an intersectionality point of view. So it's all about coming together, because we can only fight this together rather than being separated. Together we are stronger. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ubaid. Thank you so much for your vulnerability, for sharing your own lived experience with us. And I absolutely agree that it's important to ensure we're finding a balance between celebrating ethnic minority LGBT plus history, but also acknowledging that there's a lot more work to be done and, to meaningfully address institutional forms of oppression, especially with regards to holding leaders accountable within policing, to ensure that this systemic change does happen. So thank you so much for sharing your insight. I am now going to hand over to Rhammel, who is a community organizer and was the Director of Communications for Pride in London from 2019 to 2021. He is a trustee of Police Now and a special inspector for the Metropolitan Police Force and has been involved in policing for 9 years. So over to you, Rhammel.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's been really insightful to actually listen to all the other speakers. I found myself, you couldn't see me, but I was kind of clicking in the background, and I was trying to give you a few emojis because it's not often actually that we get this space to hear and actually feel kind of safe to talk about all of these different experiences. One of the things I reflected on today is that today I'm broadcasting directly from New Scotland Yard, one of the open plan offices on the 3rd floor, and I actually had to really consider whether I wanted to sit in the open plan office and speak my own truth in the middle of the heart of British policing, and it saddens me that I had to consider that and think about actually will I end up thinking about my tone or thinking about what I'm going to contribute differently because I'm sat in the middle of the floor with other colleagues. And that in itself to me is a kind of a testament to the situation that we find ourselves in now, is that I'm in a should be in what most people would consider it maybe the most safest building in the UK at the moment, and yet to have these conversations still feels really difficult. So yeah, so absolutely. For today, I'm coming at this as someone who's been a community organizer for almost 2 decades. I'm absolutely coming at this as somebody who's been involved in policing formally for 9 years, but a lot longer. As someone who's been cognizant of being at the sharp end of both racism and homophobia at the hands of policing, at both while I've been within it, but also before I've been more formally involved. But I also come at it from a point of empowering other people. A core part of my work is empowering young people in particular to really speak truth and to kind of speak out about the political and social change that what they want to see. And so I'm very cognizant that quite often in policing we talk about need to be careful about things being political, but actually when we're talking about people's underpinning human rights, actually by the nature of that already things are political. And I'm actually when I hear people talking about that, immediately my back is up, because I think to myself, well, actually this is political. If we have trans officers who will experience an increased rate of hate crime for themselves, or we have a situation where the government are suggesting a rollback of rights for trans people, etc., just because policing sits in the middle of that doesn't mean that we have to kind of close our eyes and just kind of go with it. I think we have to still carve out a space to make sure that we can support and acknowledge the people who are part of our communities, and that means our staff and police officers, but also the communities that we have to work with to support them through whatever crime or experiences that they're having. And so that's the kind of lens that I'm coming at it with. I'm going to try and shorten things a little, which means I will kind of, as Saba kind of mentioned, I will end up going between lots of different issues. But the main reason for that is because I really want to make sure that we cover lots of ground ahead of being able to ask questions, so we set ourselves up really, really well. And so I guess the themes that I want to touch on really are a kind of, talking certainly about how the intersection of racism and LGBT phobia. I want to talk a bit about seeking refuge and what that looks like for people who are sitting in that kind of intersection. And I do want to talk a little bit about solidarity. So those are 3 things that I'm hoping to kind of cover in the very short amount of time. First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge and go back to what Kimberley was talking about, and talk about the fact that actually those who are perhaps, those who are potentially, in my case, potentially Black and LGBT people, is actually how quite often I think the expectation and the conversations that we're having, as Ubaid kind of carefully called out, is that we're expected to talk about those experiences separately, except quite often we come at the sharp end of experiencing them both at the same time, and we're at the sharp end of those intra-community issues as well. And so what am I talking about? It's definitely the things that Ubaid talked about, going to your LGBT network wanting to talk about racism and no one wanting to hear you, going to somewhere else in the organization where we're talking about race and wanting to talk about how it intersects with some of these other issues and not hearing it and not being heard. And that's definitely part of it, but actually sometimes it's more harrowing than that. It's sometimes actually having a really awful experience, and I can think back to one I had in November. I'm not going to tell you the story because we definitely don't have time for that, where actually you can't decipher, is it racism today, or was it homophobia, or is it biphobia, or what is it? Is it actually a combination of those things and my age? Because I'm young, they think that I'm somebody they can play with. Actually, I wasn't born yesterday, and I've been in this space for a long time, and I can stand up for myself. But the assumption actually that sometimes your combining identity has, but also I guess is definitely about how we kind of experience those things separately and together. But for me, one of the things that we don't acknowledge and talk about is also generational trauma. So sometimes, again, we talk about those things separately. So, for example, I can relate often to not just my own experiences and the experiences of my peers, but also, the repeated experiences of Black people and Black communities in the UK, but how that collides actually with the same experiences that LGBT communities have had. And I don't know if some of you may have seen that Catherine Roper, who's now new Chief Constable, formerly at the Met, has apologised, and that's a good example of acknowledging that actually we're not even just kind of apologising for what's happening now. We're actually apologising for these generational issues and how actually that affects how I relate to anything that's happening right here in the moment. I also wanted to touch on the kind of ahistorical representation, and I was so glad, Kimberley, because you helped me out a bit. It meant I could cut down some things when you talked a little bit about kind of the experience of being whitewashing. And you might think, well, again, that feels obvious. But for me, there's something really particularly stressful and kind of demoralizing about the lack of acknowledgement of Black communities, particularly in their role in LGBT rights, whether that be about what community building looks like, and acknowledging that actually it may be that intersectionality was a term first born in 1989, and the framework that Kimberley Crenshaw put together really ultimately was to talk about the intersection of Black women and at Black women in particular, but actually how some of the framework for that has helped us build in other movements, and how actually over time we do borrow from each other, and how that becomes important to intersectionality too. But I was really proud to see Ted Brown. Ted Brown's a really good example of a moment in history, in LGBT history, that kind of forms the modern pride movements in the UK. And if we were to leave it to those who've documented our history, we'd be left to believe it was a couple of white men that came together who happened to be gay. We wouldn't be thinking about the Ted Browns of the world, the Phil Poptukimis who are more recent history but are important to acknowledge. And I think that comes into how we both not only seek out history, which I'm glad you had some recommendations on some books, again, saved me some talking time there, but also how we document history. So looking and holding to account people like Queer Britain, actually, we're documenting history, we're getting better at these things, but are we thinking about how we document history in terms of those intersections? And then I also wanted to talk about the particular violence that I don't think sometimes we really acknowledge in seeking out refuge from perhaps racism, and finding a space in an affinity group or wherever it is, or you're part of a conversation that feels really uplifting, and then realizing that it can't be a space where you can bring your whole self, and the violence that comes with that. So if you just think about people who have come to a place and sought out collective care, they've sought out something to help build on and kind of dismantle things that are particularly problematic, but in the process of doing that, actually having to dismantle those things, and how sitting at a particular intersection can sometimes make you feel particularly unique in a unique place to kind of dismantle some of those things, but just how exhausting it is for those people to finally found that one place where maybe we can have an easy conversation about things, but realizing actually, hang on, I still can't quite bring everything to the table. And that's why one of the things that you will notice today is I do talk about communities a lot. I don't talk about community. I deliberately pluralize, because I think it's absolutely imperative that we talk against this idea of a homogeneous, the homogeneous kind of block. We aren't a homogeneous block. There are communities, and that's really important when we're talking about these issues. You'll notice I retire the term of visibility, because I think sometimes we don't talk about the harm that comes with visibility. So being a public face of sometimes a struggle and what comes with that. So as someone who has definitely been in that position, I can tell you now for free that actually, unless we're willing to put in the work to safeguard those people that we put forward, then actually this also becomes a difficult situation. And the last term that I really have retired is allyship. And again, it's not to say that these terms are wrong, but for me, it's important that we don't talk about these things as being transactional. So it can't just be we go out and read a book and suddenly we're woke and we're all great and we're in a place. It's actually, what are we doing to continuously challenge ourselves and those around us? And a lot of these terms you'll be used to hearing in the context of one particular kind of strand, but actually how do we do that and point back at ourselves and reflect on things? And that includes me. I don't separate myself from that. And then the final thing that I wanted to kind of give a line to before we open it up, hopefully, was just to talk about how the history of all of this becomes really important to how we build on things. And one of the reasons why I get really kind of depressed about ahistorical representation is because it's really important to how our community organizing needs to evolve as well. And so quite often, I find it sometimes frustrating. I have a kind of mixed relationship with terms that got popularized. So you'll notice that things like intersectionality, everyone wants to talk about it now, but actually what's the practical application look like of that? And can we acknowledge that Kimberley Crenshaw did not just come up with it in 2012 when it got popularized, actually 1989, and even then that was a body of work that was looking at things that were already existing. So I think sometimes we have to come at it from actually, non-binary people aren't new to this, non-binary Black people aren't new to this conversation. Actually, the way in which we express ourselves and the way we define ourselves has evolved, but actually we've existed, we have been there, we've been there in solidarity. I don't want to get too political, but there are obviously lots of very big issues happening in the world, and sometimes we're questioning why should we bother to support those people if they've never supported us before, when actually that's just not the truth. And so I wanted to say that as a message, because our solidarity has to be born of that kind of understanding that this isn't a new, even though we're providing the spaces to talk about these issues, these aren't new, and people have had to operate in those intersections for a long time, and an acknowledgement that our communities are maturing, and so therefore the way we talk to and build relationships with communities as police forces will need to evolve too, because ultimately people are becoming unapologetic, and the reason that they feel rooted in that unapologetic stuff is because they feel they've been putting in the labor, they feel they've been speaking to brick walls for a long time, and they're not getting the acknowledgement. And so people maybe they are listening, they're just about listening, but are they hearing, are they taking action, etc. And so that's why I talk a lot more about kind of proactive solidarity as opposed to allyship, because I just don't want people to sit in this idea that they've done their one bit of allyship for the month and then that's how it works. So those are the things I wanted to bring to the table, and we'll hopefully talk about as people sort of ask questions. Hopefully that was kind of within the time.
Thank you so much, Rhammel. Yeah, if I'd kept my time, it definitely would have been within the time. But thank you so much. You did a really great job of touching on so many different powerful and really interesting points within such a short space of time. And I'm so glad as well that you feel safe in this space, that you feel able to have this conversation. But again, the fact that you had to consider whether to join this call within an open space shows that there's definitely a lot of ways to go. Thank you for bringing to the forefront the whitewashing LGBT plus history, and sometimes often that transactional nature of allyship, and for that final really powerful point around proactive solidarity. So thank you so much. Now we are going to quickly transition into panel discussion. I'm not sure if everybody will have a chance to speak because we're really short on time, but I'm going to put my first question to Andy. So I don't know if you're still there, Andy. I know you were struggling a little bit in the park, but no, the question
I'm still here.
Amazing, great. So the question I have for you is that there has been some criticism around the Race Action Plan, excluding the experiences of individuals who experience multiple forms of marginalization. You did kind of touch on it, and Saba also kind of mentioned, the very heteronormative, cisnormative, and Western-centric perspective that is often kind of applied to a lot of this kind of work within policing. But I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about your perspective on this and what you think could be done to address these concerns.
Well, first thing I'd like to say, obviously, the Race Action Plan, we really did push about 2021 or so. We were telling them that it needed to have an intersectional lens as well. If I'm honest, we had to fight even to get some of the things that were in it. So the Race Action Plan, probably not the best time at the minute to chat about the Race Action Plan, if I'm honest, because it is looking like it's going to be shut down in March 2025, and we haven't even released the final version of the plan just yet. So that one opportunity that we had, that energy after George Floyd's murder, that energy that the chief constables give us back in 2020 has largely dissipated. So, for a lot of the time, you said we've seen political discourse completely change, and Ubaid Rehman, Saba spoke really well to kind of the current environment that we're in. And unfortunately, policing is responding, and not probably in the way that it should. Our impartiality is being questioned, but there's a big difference between impartiality and neutral. So there is a neutrality. For me, you cannot be neutral in the face of oppression and discrimination. We have to take our stand, and we have to keep doing what we need to be doing. I say that acknowledging that it's difficult, but acknowledging that in the longer term, history, I believe, will remember those that stood up for others and those that took the easy on the path of least resistance. So for me, it's a really important point to recognise that. The race action plan, as I said, we have had a lot of frustration. We were really well engaged at the start, and then we kind of, it's just lost its momentum. So I think for me, the biggest thing, like Saba said, have communities around it, have those that are most impacted by these issues, listen to them, not just put plans in place, but put structures in, because I think the only way to deal with institutional issues is either pull down the institution and the structures which are there and rebuild new ones that work for everyone, or put checks and measures at every single part of where we need to be. And again, in Northern Ireland, we got to do that quite well. And it's a completely different service to what I joined in 1999. So change is possible, but it takes external pushes and drivers to do so. So the community must all come together and tell policing what exactly we protect us. So that for me is kind of part of the problems, but also some of the solutions and where we need to get to.
Thank you so much, Andy. And I think as well, what you said really kind of speaks to what Rhammel was just saying about proactive solidarity, and the fact as well that solidarity needs to be consistent. It can't just be reliant on kind of spurts of momentum as we're kind of seeing with the Race Action Plan. It's really sad to hear that it's probably not going to go ahead because that momentum has just kind of fizzled out. And that's often what we see in these spaces, you know, as ethnic minority individuals, as LGBT plus individuals. We often see that there's only interest in our cause, you know, when it's a trending issue, and that just should not be the case. You're right. We really need to rethink these systems and really incorporate meaningful approaches, which includes, you know, better inclusivity within these spaces. So thank you much for sharing, and thank you so much for sharing your perspective there. I wish we could hear more, but we just don't have time. So I'm going to throw my next question at you, Saba. So you mentioned that heteronormative, cisnormative, and Western-centric, approaches often lead to certain identities being overlooked. In this case, LGBT plus ethnic minority identities, which is, of course, you know, really impacts policy planning within policing. So, what do you think would be the best way to incorporate diverse perspectives and insights, but also considering the fact that LGBT plus ethnic minority individuals may not feel comfortable participating in advisory groups due to various barriers and this kind of backlog of systemic discrimination?
Yeah, it's really difficult. Quite a few events and things where we've tried to bring like Black LGBT voices in, or I've tried to sort of ask community members, they just don't want to do it. They just don't trust the police. And like you said, it brings in the issues of, you know, not just the homophobia, transphobia, but the racism, the sexism. So there's so many different layers and factors that they're just not interested. So it's really difficult. I mean, Andy touched on it, I think, just now. I think if I'm understood correctly, that I think community engagement is really important, because without that community engagement and understanding what the community wants and needs, you're not going to get it. So you can't write policy. I think one of the biggest problems, obviously, I only work with the Met, and I know Sis put a comment in there that, you know, for queer people of colour outside of London, it's very different. But with the Met, a lot of the decision makers are white, cis men, you know, so they're making the decisions for people of colour. I was at an event recently, for an FGM event. The Met officer that was there 3 times on the panel, he said, you know, I recognise I'm here as a white man. That's not good enough. You know, so how are you going to understand us as a community and write policy that's going to be in our favour if you're sending people, or you've got lead officers that have no understanding or recognition of us as a community? You know, without that community engagement, you're never going to understand the community.
Yeah, thank you so much, Saba. That's a really, really good point, because sometimes it can be so easy to kind of push for inclusion without really addressing the kind of the history that's there, without rebuilding those relationships. Like you said, that community engagement is so important. And that actually leads really nicely onto the question I wanted to ask Rhammel, because when me and Rhammel met before this and we had a kind of a brief conversation about what we'll be speaking about in the space, Rhammel, you mentioned that the importance of relationship building outside of affinity spaces and events which celebrate LGBT plus folks, like Black Pride or Pride, for example. Now, there are a lot of police that would expect to be able to attend such events like Pride, especially if they identify as LGBT plus. But you had a different perspective on this. And I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail as to why this first relationship building step is necessary, just kind of building on what Saba said.
Yeah, I mean, I think I hold the quite controversial view that ultimately, until policing can get into a very different space, extremely different space to the space that it's in, that as an organization, and as institutions, I don't think we can expect to be present in certain community spaces. I just don't think so. And I think that unfortunately, because quite often the law is on our side in terms of being quite literally in people's spaces, I think sometimes there is a certain entitlement that's felt that as an organization, that means we must be present, we must be able to build those relationships. Actually, it may be that those spaces aren't the right spaces to be building those relationships, and it needs to happen somewhere else so that people can feel safe in those spaces. And Pride's a good example of that. There's been a controversy, obviously, around particularly the Met being in Pride parades. And I think that ultimately we have to take stock and acknowledge the hurt that people are experiencing. And that's where the generational trauma for me comes into it, because that's why it's important to understand the historical context of some of these things, because actually we're not just sitting with, as has been mentioned, Stephen Paul or Sarah Everard, or the issues that have been kind of really pertinent through Baroness Casey's report. We're also sitting with all of those generational issues as well, and what that brings to the table. But this is why actually one of the things I'm starting to talk a lot more about is cultural intelligence, because these issues are compounded by people just not having a clue. And so why sometimes it feels safer to have someone show up in a space who looks like us, who can talk about it. But actually, for me, that still has to be rooted in a real understanding and engagement, and somebody who's really willing to put the labor into understanding different communities, because otherwise what we end up with is potentially what looks like great representation, but when you look underneath the bonnet, actually it's just a face who's perhaps willing to kind of stand up in front of what is still particularly awful practices. And so sometimes I'll try not to just focus on who showed up, but actually the work that they're willing to put in, I think, is more important. And are they rooted in that cultural intelligence? And interestingly, as as institutions that are, that talk about intelligence separately as an importance to building pictures and to understanding circumstance, it's interesting that we've not spent enough time really building up that cultural intelligence so that people are really armed and empowered, because that's what the most important thing is here, to make the right decisions. And then it becomes easier to kind of see the wood for the trees, because once you've empowered people to make the right decision in the first place, then it's really clear to see who's actually standing out and against what is right. And that's why, I get frustrated by conversations about ignorance. Okay, great, fine, I get what you're saying, but if we put people in a position where they are empowered to make the right decisions, suddenly, when we talk about these microaggressions, suddenly those microaggressions stand out, because actually we've given you the tools to navigate this and you've still chosen to choose otherwise. And that's the position that we need to get ourselves in. And unfortunately, I think this is where the excuse is seeping about whether we can actually make progress, because we don't even have the benchmark. And that's why it's really saddening to hear what Andy was saying about the race action plan. Firstly, we need to get the right benchmark in the first place so we can measure up against something that's actually truly going to be transformational. Because if we don't, then ultimately all the work is in vain, because we're just chasing each other. So that for me is my response on that. And I think it would be considered a controversial take, and one that I think, the LGBT network at the Met would probably not take the stance on. But for me, I think we just have to acknowledge that hurt, that real hurt and violence that is still felt by communities.
Thank you, Rhammel. And I don't think it's controversial. I think there are multiple opinions on this. I think that there are many people that align with your perspective for the very reasons you've just shared, and then there'll be others who don't align, perhaps because there is that further consciousness they need to build, that cultural awareness they need to build, as you mentioned. And also, I'd love to just add that, you know, this cultural competence is dynamic. There's no finish line for proactive solidarity. It's a continuous journey, a continuous commitment. It requires continuous, you know, energy to keep doing this work. So thank you so much, Rhammel, for bringing that important kind of reflection into this space. And finally, Ubaid, you really pushed for the topic of this intersection between institutionalized LGBT plus phobia and institutionalized racism to be the central theme of today's MBPA LGBT History Month. I was wondering if you could really briefly, I'm sorry, we're so short on time, tell us from your perspective what a next step could look like in this conversation.
Yeah, I can definitely. Can I just go back a little bit and just touch on what Rhammel and Saba said? Because that's a really important piece of this conversation that needs to be aired. I think so. Someone's saying we need more community engagement. We do have community engagement. So if you go into the Met Police and other forces and say we need community engagement, they'll say we do have community engagement. Tick box, done. You know, move on. But what doesn't exist at the moment is that in those spaces, and Saba and I have been in those spaces, and Rhammel as well, where those communities are saying something to the police. So they're saying there is institutional homophobia, there's institutional racism, there's this, there's this, there's this, there's this. And then you'll have commanders stand up, and they'll be from different, you know, there might be white, there might be women, there might, you know, so forth. But they'll say, I hear you making noise, but I'm denying that exists. I'm denying that actually what your experiences are not what mirrors with us and stuff. And so we are doing community engagement. We're not doing it to the point that actually listening and actually taking on board what people are saying. Saba and I were in a community engagement event which was about LGBT advisory group that set up to talk about institutional homophobia to the commissioner of the Met Police and the deputy mayor of Mopac, and they still stood up and said there's no institutional homophobia in the police. You know, so that's a prime example of community engagement happening, but actually it's not really effective. But coming back to your question, I think going forward, I think we definitely need to hold more of these spaces where, you know, there's a psychological space, there's a community approach to this issue, but we need leads, police leads, as well as staff network leads to really take this subject and give it more of a open space to actually have these conversations, because what we've touched on today is only just a, you know, tiny little bit about the whole area, and we haven't done it justice by doing it an hour and a half. But you know, it's a start, and I think holding more of this space at conferences, at you know, policing events, etc., and really holding people to account, senior people in positions of power, holding them to account on actually taking these and taking them forward. So yeah, I think community engagement, community approach, a robust kind of you know, staff networks coming together, holding that psychological safety space. But then my last point would be about data and really focusing on building that data set. At the moment, we've got anecdotal information. We got people saying something here, people saying something over here. We need to bring this all together and really, and not just about quantitative data but qualitative, really building on what, you know, the Casey review really had quotes in there, the Black Workforce Survey that Uplift College of Policing have produced. There's great information in there, bringing all that information together to really pull this out and really showcase that actually there is institutional discrimination on all different levels, and there's institutional denial if we're not taking this on and moving it forward.
Thank you so much, Ubaid, and definitely for spotlighting that tokenism that happens very, very often, you know, the check boxes. So thank you so much, panel. I now want to put it out to our audience. We only have probably time for one question, but do still put your questions in the chat box, and perhaps our panel can maybe answer later, or we can have kind of just to think around those questions a little bit later, you know, going forward for future conversations. So yeah, if you have a question, please do pop it in the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself. I do quickly want to ask our panel, are you happy for me to put your LinkedIn and your names in the chat box so that people can kind of follow you and continue this conversation? All right, I'll go ahead and do that. So yeah, any questions from our audience? I can't see if anyone's putting their hand up. I'm not sure if
there aren't any hands up yet, but don't be shy. I've got to say, when I knew I was on a panel with Ubaid and Rhammel, I was amazed. I was kind of in awe. So you've got an opportunity to ask two incredible people questions.
4, sorry, including Andy. 4 incredible people.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Andy. No, Andy's left, hasn't he? He's left the meeting.
I was trying to spotlight you, Saba. You're amazing.
Oh, no. Honestly,
don't downplay yourself.
Can you fangirl the bed and Rhammel? I don't know. I just did.
I can see a
Rhammel's got his hand
question
up.
from Rhammel.
Yeah, I guess as we haven't had questions, I was just going to say one thing. I guess is just, although I can just see a hand has just gone up. The one thing I was going to say quickly, I guess, is I will post the article that I wrote when I left Pride in London quite publicly, which I think actually really speaks to a lot of the issues that we've spoken about today, and how, you know, it almost kind of speaks to the issue of like finding refuge at what was a Pride organization, but then having to face racism and acknowledging actually what that meant in the context of how we needed to show up in the world at that time. So I'll try and find that article because that might be helpful to further explain some of the points that I've made in a disjointed way. But we've got more questions.
I'm just going to let Farhan just jump in here. Do you want to, because I know we're running out of time and I know you had a couple of points you wanted to make before the end.
No problem. I just had a quick question. I suppose if we're looking at that kind of institution between race and the LGBTQIA plus community, are there specific kind of times of the year, are there specific events of the year that actually we celebrate, we mark as part of, you know, perhaps our networks, our LGBT networks actually, that may actually not land in the same way for those of ethnic diverse backgrounds? So I'm thinking about things like, for example, National Coming Out Day or Visibility Days, etc. How do those kind of things land for people of all backgrounds? Do they have the same kind of meaning and reflection and celebration? Just wanted your thoughts on that. Rhammel?
I was just going to say, I think the short answer is definitely no. Some of those experiences will definitely intersect and mean that they're very similar. But I think that's why quite often I do challenge affinity groups or organisations working in this space to think about what those joint events look like outside of Coming Out Day or any specific day or Black History Month, etc. But also think when you are thinking about those specific kind of those specific moments in the year, being able to think about actually, you know, if we're having a panel, actually, how do we make sure that that's reflective of these different intersections, or are we going to have a specific moment we mark out as part of that activation that we're doing? But really thinking about what collaboration looks like, and I think actually to get to that place, you know, at the moment, I think collaboration is a key part of that. It would be nice to kind of say collaboration isn't. I'd love to be in a space where actually people just feel confident enough in those separate spaces to kind of come forward. But I think to get it right really is more of these kind of collaboration events to make sure that people feel safe to kind of experience. But I think if are those experiences the same, I don't think so. I'm not sure if there's enough time to unpack all the reasons why, but that would be my initial response.
Thank you.
We have come to time, so if you do need to head off now, please do feel free to disconnect. We're not going to hold it against you. And as Saba said in the chat box, if there are any questions that come to mind, you can always reach out to any of us on LinkedIn. Saba's put her email in there as well. So do feel free to go ahead and ask any questions. There was a couple of other hands up, but Farhan, what are you thinking about time?
I think we should let Lax ask his question. It's very important.
Oh, go ahead, Lax.
Oh, thank you. So all of this stuff and all of these topics for policing response, if you look at policing UK as a body, is always recruit. Oh, we've got a problem with this. Let's recruit more people of color. Let's recruit more officers. Let's recruit more people. And it's all about, well, we've got your skin color, you're black, you're brown, tick. You can pose in a photo. Oh, you're queer, you can wear a rainbow lanyard, a rainbow epaulet, and you can pose for a picture. Oh, you're a woman, great, tick, you can pose for a picture. So when we have this institutional denials, we have this willful ignorance, we have this gaslighting, we want to engage with you, but we don't know what you listen, so la, 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 la. Do we just have to get to a point where policing's response to everything is, well, we just need to recruit more? Is no, if you're institutionally racist, why should people of color join? If you're institutionally sexist and misogynistic, why should women join? If you're institutionally homophobic, biphobic, transphobic, why should queer people join? Do we just have to get to a point and say, no, we are not here to advocate for recruitment? Question mark.
Can I answer that very quickly?
Yeah, anybody answer.
Do you know, so Lex, I was actually in a meeting recently. I sit on the attractions CRG for the Met, which deals with recruitment. And it was Jeff Booth's last meeting. Brian Paddock was in there for some reason and someone from MOPAC. And I actually said in that meeting, I said the fact that I was really disappointed the Met were doing nothing for the LGBT plus community during History Month. Given they were trying to recruit LGBT plus people, especially people of colour. And I said that why would anyone, especially a black or brown or a person of colour from the LGBT plus community, join an organisation where they're not recognised, they're not supported, there is institutional racism, there is institutional homophobia. I know 2 LGBT community liaison officers that have left because they don't want to work there anymore. So I said, why on earth would they want to join? What am I taking back to my community? There was silence in the room. I will leave that there.
And in addition, and I'll be really quick because I know we're against time, and in addition, I actually do also support the NBPA's position on this and have done personally for quite some time. And there's 2 reasons for that. Firstly, it has to, for me, this is why I talk about trying to retire the word visibility in the context of what we're doing in these spaces, because until we can properly safeguard the people who are part of our organizations, all of our colleagues, which we fail on broadly speaking, as in for everyone, let alone when we talk about those who find themselves at the sharp end of specific types of discrimination. So until we can absolutely be guaranteed and we can be happy that people will be safeguarded and supported and will have those, the correct measures in place to make sure that they can not just survive in these spaces, but actually thrive. I don't think it becomes particularly controversial to say that we won't personally vouch for more people. And this is there's an old term really in this sector around kind of, the obvious, which is that you can have as much people kind of recruited into these spaces, but if there's no kind of inclusion when they arrive, then it's all in vain, to be honest. And I think that's the most easy way to summarize my response to that.
Can I just add as well quickly that Lax, you're completely right. The focus is about recruitment, but the focus should actually be on retention at the other end, because policing gets to a point where it's like someone decides to leave for whatever reason, and we're like, yeah, exit interviews here, take care, gone. That information we need to be working on that way before they get to that point of exit interviews, and feeding that information, getting that information beforehand. They're actually starting to find out what is actually going on and focus on retention rather than recruitment. We get people coming in droves, and then they're going out in droves as well. So, you know, the focus needs to be there rather than at the front. But sadly, yeah, it's just about recruitment, drive diversity, and don't care about that diversity once they get in, because we want them to start becoming just like us, and you know, not and lose their authentic selves and stuff, and just blend in to everyone else in the culture and stuff. But it's about how do we keep them being themselves, and keep taking their experience and the knowledge and making improvement in policing. But we just don't care about that once they get in. It's like, yeah, carry on.
Tick.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to hand over to Farhan. Thank you so much. You've been such an amazing and insightful panel. And again, please do connect with these amazing individuals after this space if you do have any other questions. They are wealths of knowledge and absolute forces for change. So I'm just going to hand over to Farhan to close up the space.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Kimmy for an incredible and insightful session today, and to all of our speakers, Andy, Saba, Rhammel and Ubaid, for your insights, for all the information that you've given, and actually your passion and commitment to ensuring sort of inclusivity for all people of ethnicity, LGBTQIA backgrounds, and other diverse groups as well. I think, as you said, you know, this is just kind of scratching the surface. I think events like this are important. Intersectional events are important, and in the National Black Police Association, we're really committed to kind of bringing those conversations together, not just focusing on race, but actually focusing on race for all those people that are impacted, you know, all the kind of different diverse characteristics that have an impact with the intersection with race. So just wanted to kind of end with a few sort of other things that we are doing in the National Black Police Association, events for your diary. On the 1st of March, there is an event marking International Women's Day called Inspire Inclusion. That's being held in person at New Scotland Yard on the 1st of March on the 8th floor. So if you are interested, please do get in contact with us at the email address on the screen, blackpoliceassociation2@met.police.uk. That's the Met BPA that are organising and hosting that event. Also, as part of the National Black Police Association, for Ramadan this year, which is the Islamic month of fasting, we are holding a fasting collective, which was started in Surrey Police back in 2021 and is now being hosted nationally. There will be, on the 21st of March, a fasting collective in Birmingham, Glasgow, Surrey and Manchester, which is a challenge to our colleagues to observe a fast with their Muslim colleagues and communities. And there will be an invitation to a mosque for an amazing iftar meal in the evening. So again, an incredible display of solidarity with sort of diverse colleagues and different ethnic faith groups as well. And finally, obviously, you will know that April will mark the Stephen Lawrence Day. We are currently in the midst of planning our Stephen Lawrence Day conference, which will be on the 19th of April. That's a Friday, and it will be hosted again at the University of East London. We're just finalising the kind of key bits of planning for that. So more details will be coming out about the Stephen Lawrence Day conference very, very shortly. So please do put that into your diaries. That will be in London at the University of East London, and will be, I'm sure, an incredible event. And lastly, obviously, this is the first time we've done an event for LGBT History Month, and we want to ensure in the NBPA that we are always improving and doing better and bringing you events and activity that really empower, inform you in all sort of areas of inclusion, especially race inclusion. So please do click on this QR code. We will send a link to your emails as well, but please do complete a registration for us. It allows us to learn what we did well, what we could do better. Perhaps we could finish on time better. Essentially, it is really, really important that we get your feedback as well. So all I want to say, again, thank you again to all of our speakers, and thank you all for coming today and being part of this conversation. We really, really do appreciate it. We hope you have a fantastic rest of the day.